You're driving home from work on a Tuesday evening, traffic's light, your favorite song is playing. Then you see those flashing lights in your rearview mirror and your heart drops into your stomach. Even if you've done nothing wrong, that moment triggers something primal in most of us. Your hands get a little sweaty. Your mind races through the last 5 minutes of driving. Did I use my turn signal? Was I speeding? What did I do? And then comes the real question that almost nobody thinks about until it's too late. What am I actually required to say right now? Most people believe they understand their rights during a traffic stop. They've seen enough movies, watched enough police procedurals, heard the phrase, you have the right to remain silent, enough times that it feels embedded in their DNA. But here's the uncomfortable truth. When you're actually sitting in your car with an officer standing at your window, almost everything you thought you knew suddenly becomes murky. The line between being polite and accidentally incriminating yourself is thinner than you think. The difference between a question you must answer and one you can decline is something most law schools struggle to teach clearly, let alone something the average driver understands. This isn't about being anti-police. It's not about being difficult or uncooperative. It's about understanding a system that operates on technicalities where a single sentence can transform a routine stop into something that follows you for years. Because here's what nobody tells you. Police officers are trained communicators. They know how to ask questions that feel mandatory even when they're completely optional. They understand human psychology better than most therapists, and they use that understanding every single day. So let's talk about what actually happens during a traffic stop, what the law really says, and why so many people end up in situations they never saw coming. The moment those lights go on behind you, a specific legal framework activates. You're being detained. Not arrested necessarily, but detained. There's a crucial distinction here that changes everything about what comes next. During a detention, you have certain rights, but you also have certain obligations. And understanding which is which might be the most important legal knowledge you never received in school. Let's start with what you absolutely must do. In every state in America, you're required to provide your driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance when asked. This isn't optional. This isn't something you can decline based on principle or privacy concerns. The act of driving on public roads means you've implicitly consented to prove you're licensed and insured. Refusing to hand over these documents will escalate the situation immediately and legally. The officer has every right at that point to remove you from the vehicle, and you'll likely be cited or arrested for failure to comply. But here's where it gets interesting. Beyond those three documents, almost everything else enters gray territory. The officer walks up to your window. You hand over your license and registration. Then comes the question that feels so innocuous, so routine, that most people answer without thinking. Do you know why I pulled you over? Stop right there. This is the first trap, and it's brilliant in its simplicity. If you say yes and explain what you think you did wrong, you've just confessed to a violation. If you were speeding and you say, "Was I going too fast?" you've handed the officer evidence they can use in court. Your own words become testimony against you. But if you say no, some people worry they'll seem dishonest or uncooperative, so they stumble through an answer that usually makes things worse. Here's the thing. You don't have to answer that question at all. A simple, "I'm not sure, officer," isn't lying, isn't rude, and doesn't give away anything. Or you can just stay silent and wait for them to tell you, because they're going to tell you anyway. They already know why they pulled you over. The question isn't for their benefit, it's for yours to potentially incriminate yourself. Then comes the next level. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? These seem like small talk, friendly conversation. The officer might even smile when they ask. But these aren't casual questions. They're investigative tools. Your answer helps them build a profile, establish timeline, create context. If you're coming from a bar district at midnight, that information matters to them. If you're headed somewhere unusual at an odd hour, they're taking note. Every detail you provide is another piece of data they can use. And here's the critical part. You don't have to answer these questions either. They're not related to the traffic violation. They're fishing for probable cause to expand the stop into something bigger. You can politely decline. "I'd prefer not to answer that" is a complete sentence. Will some officers push back? Absolutely. Some might say, "I'm just making conversation," or "It's a simple question." But legally, you're not required to provide that information. This is where most people start to feel uncomfortable. We're raised to be polite, to answer adults when they ask us questions, to cooperate with authority figures. The idea of declining to answer a police officer feels wrong somehow, like we're being difficult or we have something to hide. But having rights and exercising rights are two completely different things. Choosing not to answer questions isn't an admission of guilt. It's a recognition that anything you say can and will be used against you. And that statement isn't just something they say on TV. It's a literal warning about how the system works. Now let's talk about the question that changes everything. Mind if I search your car? If an officer asks this question, it means they don't have probable cause to search without your permission. If they had probable cause, they wouldn't ask. They'd inform you they're conducting a search. The question itself is an admission that they need your consent. And here's what most people don't realize. The vast majority of searches during traffic stops happen because the driver said yes. You have every right to say no. "I don't consent to searches" is a phrase you're legally allowed to use. The officer might not like it. They might ask again. They might say something like, "What are you hiding?" Or "Innocent people don't refuse searches." But none of that changes the law. Without your consent or probable cause, they cannot legally search your vehicle during a routine traffic stop. Of course, probable cause is where things get complicated. If the officer smells marijuana, sees drug paraphernalia in plain view, or has another specific articulable reason to believe there's evidence of a crime in your vehicle, they can search without permission. But a hunch isn't probable cause. Not liking your attitude isn't probable cause. Refusing to answer questions isn't probable cause. Here's a scenario that plays out thousands of times every day. The officer asks if you've been drinking. You say you had one beer with dinner 3 hours ago, being honest. Now they have reasonable suspicion to investigate further. They might ask you to perform field sobriety tests. You think refusing makes you look guilty, so you agree. You're nervous, the ground is uneven, you're not an athlete, and you fail a test that even sober people struggle with under pressure. Now, you're being arrested for DUI, and your own cooperation created the evidence chain that led there. The alternative? When asked if you've been drinking, you can say, "I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent." It sounds dramatic. It feels confrontational. But it's legal, it's your right, and it prevents you from providing evidence against yourself. Field sobriety tests are another area drowning in misconceptions. People think they're mandatory. They're not. In most states, you can refuse field sobriety tests without legal penalty. The same goes for portable breathalyzers on the roadside. These are different from the official breathalyzer at the station, which often does carry penalties for refusal under implied consent laws. But those roadside tests? Usually optional. Let's address the elephant in the room. If you're actually guilty of something, shouldn't you just cooperate and face the consequences? Here's why that thinking is dangerous. First, you might not be guilty of anything, but your cooperation could create evidence that makes it look like you are. Second, the American legal system is based on the principle that the government must prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, not that individuals must prove innocence. Your silence isn't obstruction, it's the system working as designed. There's also the reality that many traffic stops expand beyond their initial purpose through a process called pretextual stops. An officer pulls you over for a minor violation like a broken taillight, then uses that opportunity to investigate other potential crimes. They might bring a drug dog to walk around your car. They might ask increasingly invasive questions. They might detain you longer than necessary. All of this is legal up to a point, but that point is determined by what information you've provided and what consent you've given. The Supreme Court case Rodriguez versus United States established that police cannot extend a traffic stop beyond the time necessary to handle the matter for which you were stopped unless they have reasonable suspicion of other criminal activity. But how do they establish that reasonable suspicion? Often through your answers to their questions and your consent to additional investigation. Here's something most people never consider. You can ask questions too. "Am I free to go?" is one of the most powerful questions you can ask during a police encounter. If they say yes, you can leave. If they say no, you're being detained, and you have the right to know why. "Why am I being detained?" forces the officer to articulate their legal justification for holding you. This matters in court if anything goes wrong, but there's a massive gap between knowing your rights and effectively exercising them. The power dynamic during a traffic stop isn't equal. The officer has a badge, a gun, a radio connected to dozens of other officers, and the authority to make your day significantly worse. You have a driver's license and hopefully a phone. Being right about your rights doesn't prevent you from being arrested, having your car impounded, or spending a night in jail. The courtroom is where rights are truly adjudicated, not the roadside. This creates an impossible tension. Exercise your rights too forcefully, and you risk escalation. Don't exercise them at all, and you risk providing evidence that will be used against you. There's no perfect answer, no script that works in every situation. The officer might be having a bad day. They might interpret your silence as suspicious. They might genuinely believe they're just doing their job thoroughly. So what's the practical approach? Start with courtesy. Being respectful doesn't mean surrendering your rights. You can decline to answer questions politely. Officer, I'd prefer not to answer that, said calmly, is very different from, I don't have to tell you anything, shouted aggressively. You can refuse consent to searches without being confrontational. I understand you're doing your job, but I don't consent to any searches, acknowledges their position while maintaining your boundary. Keep your hands visible, don't make sudden movements. Announce what you're doing before you do it. My registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for it now. These small actions reduce tension and show you're not a threat. Remember, the officer doesn't know you. They don't know if you're reaching for a document or a weapon. Making them feel safe often makes you safer too. Document everything you can. Most phones can record audio or video. Know your state's laws about recording police, but in general, you have the right to record any public encounter. That recording might be the only thing that proves what actually happened if your case goes to court. And here's something that gets overlooked. You can and should remain silent, but you need to invoke that right explicitly. Just staying quiet isn't enough legally. You need to say, I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, or I want to speak to a lawyer. Once you invoke these rights clearly, the questioning is supposed to stop. Not always immediately, not always cleanly, but legally, they're required to respect that invocation. The aftermath of a traffic stop is just as important as the stop itself. If you were cited, read the ticket carefully, understand what you're accused of and what the deadline is for responding. If you were arrested, don't talk about what happened with anyone except your lawyer, not your cellmate, not the officer who seems sympathetic, not your friends when you're released. People think the right to remain silent only applies during interrogation. It applies always. Anything you say can be used against you, and that includes conversations you think are private or off the record. Let's bring this full circle. Understanding your rights during a traffic stop isn't about being difficult. It's about recognizing that the legal system operates on information, and you're not required to be the source of information that might harm you. It's about knowing that police officers have a job to do, and part of that job is investigating and gathering evidence. It's about accepting that being cooperative and being smart are not mutually exclusive, but they're also not the same thing. Every traffic stop is unique. Every officer is different. Every jurisdiction has its own quirks and procedures, but the fundamental rights remain consistent. You must provide identification and vehicle documents. Everything else, almost everything else, is optional. How you navigate that optional territory determines whether a minor traffic stop stays minor or becomes a defining moment with consequences that ripple through your life. The flashing lights will eventually turn off. The officer will eventually walk back to their car. You'll eventually drive away, hopefully with nothing more than a warning or a ticket you can handle. But the decisions you made during those 10 minutes, the questions you answered or didn't answer, the consents you gave or withheld, those decisions are what determine whether you're simply driving away or driving toward complications you never imagined. Know your rights. Exercise them thoughtfully, and understand that in that moment when the lights flash behind you, you have more power than you think. Not unlimited power, not consequence-free power, but real legal protections that exist specifically for moments like these. Use them wisely.